The High Council's observer expected silence. Instead, he heard laughter. Diplomatic observer Kael stood on the bridge of the UNS Iron Lesson, watching humans replay their own worst-case invasion scenario for the sixth time that week. Other species who witnessed a single simulated war retreated into mourning rituals for a generation. Humans adjusted the difficulty and asked for another round. Kael had come expecting to document trauma. What he found instead was a warship whose entire midsection existed for one purpose: to make catastrophe survivable through repetition. The machine responsible for that repetition was about to run hotter than most ships run in actual combat. On the bridge, Chief Systems Engineer Mara Okonkwo watched the same replay through a diagnostic overlay Kael couldn't see. To her, this wasn't spectacle. It was thermal load data. Every simulated missile volley, every collapsing formation, every worst-case hull breach the crew trained against was computed in real time by a system one deck below them: the Combat Cognition Core. It didn't play a recording. It calculated an entire battle, sensor frame by sensor frame, exactly as if the threat were real. That fidelity was the entire point. And it was also the reason Mara's afternoon would involve inspecting 9 tons of humming, liquid-cooled hardware before the crew asked for round 7. Deck 4, amidships. A circular hatch with a raised hexagonal rim marked the entry to the Combat Cognition Core. Mara pressed her palm to the release and the panel slid open into a compartment, humming at a frequency you felt in your teeth. 12-blade compute racks lined both walls, each blade fed by braided coolant lines glowing faint teal under diagnostic lighting. This was Comp 01, the rack architecture responsible for generating every enemy maneuver, every sensor return, every collapsing bulkhead the crew had just watched unfold. It wasn't playback. It was simulation at full sensor fidelity, meaning the compute load didn't fake the weight of war. It carried it. Kael followed her in, careful not to touch anything. "This entire compartment," he said, "exists only to imagine violence?" Mara shook her head. "It exists to survive it before it happens." She traced a coolant line with one gloved finger to the manifold Compo 2, a brushed steel distribution hub where 12 racks worth of waste heat converged into a single loop. The dielectric coolant flowing through it wasn't just cooling silicon. It was electrically insulating it, letting dense compute stacks sit inches apart without shorting. Every simulated battle the crew requested pushed that loop closer to its limit. The core wasn't a comfort. It was a piece of hardware built to run as hot as war itself. Kael asked the question that had been sitting behind his amber eyes since he boarded. Why not simulate at lower resolution? Save the strain. Mara pulled up a diagnostic pane only she could interpret cleanly. Because a low-fidelity scenario teaches low-fidelity instincts. The core didn't approximate an incoming strike. It modeled sensor noise, structural stress propagation, atmospheric interference, and 12 other variables simultaneously, exactly as real combat sensors would report them. That meant every compute blade in Comp-01 ran at near maximum sustained load for the full duration of a scenario, not in short bursts. Training the crew to trust their instincts meant refusing to let the machine lie to them, even slightly. The heat was the cost of honesty. This was the part Kael struggled to reconcile. On his homeworld, a single high-fidelity simulation of catastrophic loss was considered a psychological weapon, something used to break enemy morale, never to train one's own people. Humanity had turned the same tool inward, voluntarily, repeatedly, and treated the resulting exhaustion as Tuesday. Mara didn't see contradiction in that. She saw specification. The core's node racks were rated for continuous high-density computation precisely because someone had decided, at the design stage, that humans would ask for this. The hardware wasn't reacting to an unusual demand. It was built from the first blueprint to expect it. A soft chime interrupted them. On Mara's overlay, one rack in Comp-01 had crossed into an amber thermal band. Not dangerous yet, but close enough to matter. She moved to the affected blade without urgency. This was routine, not crisis. The coolant loop feeding that rack was carrying more heat than its neighbors, likely because the crew's current scenario had escalated into simultaneous multi-vector combat, doubling the sensor fusion workload. She explained it plainly. More variables meant more calculation meant more heat, and more heat meant the loop had less margin before the system would automatically throttle that blade to protect it. The machine could think as hard as the crew demanded, but not forever and not without limits. Kael watched the amber warning fade back to teal as the throttling system quietly redistributed load across the rack. No alarms, no panic. Just a machine doing exactly what it was engineered to do, under exactly the kind of stress it was engineered to expect. He realized then what unsettled him wasn't the crew's appetite for harder scenarios. It was how unremarkable the whole compartment made that appetite feel. On his ship, a system running this close to its thermal ceiling would have triggered an emergency briefing. Here, it triggered Mara glancing at a readout and moving on. The core wasn't a weapon aimed outward. It was infrastructure, as ordinary and as carefully engineered as anything else keeping this ship alive. Mara led Kael toward the far end of the compartment, past a rack sitting slightly recessed from the others. "This one's offline," she said, on purpose. Every 12-blade rack in Compo 1 had a silent 13th partner wired in but idle, an N+1 redundancy configuration, standard in any system where failure mid-calculation wasn't acceptable. If an active blade crossed its thermal ceiling and had to shut down, the standby blade picked up its share of the simulation within milliseconds, invisible to the crew running the scenario. It wasn't insurance against catastrophe. It was an assumption baked into the design that sustained maximum load would eventually break something, and the ship needed to keep thinking anyway. Kael found this more disquieting than the heat itself. "You built failure into the plan." Mara nodded, unbothered. "Everything fails eventually. Pretending otherwise just means you fail without a plan." The standby blades weren't a backup in case something went wrong. They were a guarantee that something eventually would, and the simulation needed to survive it anyway. It was the same philosophy running through the whole compartment. Not confidence that the crew's next requested scenario would go smoothly, but certainty that it wouldn't always, and total unwillingness to let that stop the training. To Kael, it sounded less like engineering and more like a species making peace with its own limits in advance. They moved to the compartment's forward bulkhead, where a single dense junction of cabling fed data from every rack into one processing stage. Sensor fusion. Mara explained it as the core's real skill. Raw simulated readings, radar returns, thermal blooms, structural stress values, meant little on their own. Fusion combined them into one coherent tactical picture, the same picture a real bridge crew would receive in an actual engagement. This was the layer that made the training indistinguishable from the real event, sensor for sensor. It was also the most computationally expensive stage in the entire chain, consuming nearly a third of the core's total processing load just to keep every stream synchronized to the same fraction of a second. Kael asked why fidelity mattered so much if the threat wasn't real. Mara's answer was simple: because the crew's instincts had to become real, even if the enemy wasn't. If the simulated sensor picture had any seams, any place where the fusion layer smoothed over noise instead of representing it honestly, the crew would learn to trust a picture of combat that didn't exist. That mistake, made once in training, could cost lives the first time it happened for real. So, the fusion junction ran at near its rated limit for the same reason the compute racks did, because approximation was the one shortcut the engineers had refused to build in, no matter how much heat it cost them. A request came through from the training deck. The crew wanted the scenario escalated again, this time adding a simultaneous system failure on top of the combat load. Mara relayed the parameters to the core without hesitation, though Kael noticed her check the thermal overlay first, out of habit rather than doubt. Escalating the scenario meant every rack in Comp 01 would run its redundancy pairs closer to activation. The coolant manifold would carry more waste heat, and the fusion junction would process two crises instead of one. This wasn't recklessness. It was the crew asking the machine to simulate the exact kind of layered disaster that killed people who hadn't trained for it. And the machine had been built from its very first spec sheet to say yes. Kael watched the thermal overlay shift as the escalation took hold. Amber warnings blooming briefly across 3 racks before the redundancy pairs absorbed the load and the colors settled back to teal. It happened in under 2 seconds, and nobody on the training deck above them would ever know it occurred. That, Kael realized, was the entire design philosophy laid bare. The core was built so that the crew's appetite for harder scenarios would never be limited by the machine's ability to survive them. Humans hadn't engineered around their own recklessness. They had engineered infrastructure sturdy enough that what looked like recklessness was, underneath, simply well-supported ambition. Mara pulled up one final readout. Not the current load, but the core's absolute design ceiling. Every rack, every coolant loop, every redundancy pair had a hard limit beyond which the whole system would auto-shut down rather than risk a runaway thermal event. In 3 years of operation, the Iron Lesson's crew had pushed the core to within 18% of that ceiling exactly once, during a scenario so layered it took the fusion junction nearly a full second to synchronize. An eternity by the core's standards. They hadn't stopped afterward. They'd reviewed the near-limit event, adjusted their approach, and scheduled a harder version for the following week. Kael finally understood what he would report to the High Council, and knew it wouldn't sound like the warning he'd been sent to gather. Humanity hadn't built a weapon to threaten anyone. They had built a piece of infrastructure so thoroughly engineered against failure that pushing it to its edge felt, to them, like nothing more than a hard afternoon at work. The dread other species felt when confronting simulated catastrophe wasn't absent in humans. It had simply been engineered around, redirected into copper, coolant, and redundant silicon, until it stopped being a psychological event and became a maintenance schedule instead. Kael asked the question every good diplomat eventually asks. What happens if it doesn't hold? Mara didn't deflect. A coolant leak in the manifold, rare but documented in 2 other Drillmaster-class ships, would drop pressure across the entire loop within seconds. The affected rack's redundancy pair would activate immediately, but without coolant flow to support it, the standby blade would hit its own thermal ceiling within minutes. At that point, the core's only option was graceful degradation. Shedding simulation fidelity in controlled stages, sensor stream by sensor stream, rather than crashing outright. The crew would notice the training scenario losing detail before they noticed anything else was wrong. A built-in warning, disguised as a system doing exactly what it was told to do. No engineer aboard the Iron Lesson considered this scenario theoretical. It was tested, logged, and rehearsed on a maintenance schedule, the same way the crew rehearsed combat. Mara pulled up the last recorded degradation drill. Coolant pressure had been deliberately dropped by 19% in a controlled test 8 months earlier, and the core had shed fidelity exactly as designed without ever losing the crew's tactical picture entirely. Kael realized the machine's greatest strength wasn't that it never failed. It was that failure had been so thoroughly anticipated, so completely built into the specification, that even a real fault would look from the outside like just another training exercise. Kael returned to the bridge as the crew's latest scenario reached its climax overhead. A simulated fleet engagement the Combat Cognition Core was rendering, in full sensor fidelity, coolant loops running warm but steady, redundancy pairs standing by unused. He understood now that the High Council's fear had been aimed at the wrong target. Humanity's willingness to relive catastrophe wasn't a psychological vulnerability to exploit. It was the visible surface of an engineering discipline. Copper tungsten spreaders, dielectric coolant, redundant silicon, and a fusion junction that refused to lie. All built specifically so that willingness could be repeated indefinitely without ever breaking the people or the ship running it. His final report would not describe a weapon. It would describe a training cruiser's cooling loop, its redundancy philosophy, and a compute core engineered to treat honesty about failure as a design requirement rather than a risk. The Council had sent him to measure a species' relationship with its own darkest possibilities. What he'd found was a ship that turned that relationship into copper pipes and thermal margins. Mundane, maintainable, and precisely as unremarkable as Mara had made it look. Somewhere below deck, the Iron Lesson's coolant kept moving, carrying away the heat of a war that hadn't happened yet, and might never happen at all. Next time, we trace where all that heat actually goes once it leaves the core, straight into the Iron Lesson's radiator fins. Subscribe to Irongeist HFY so you don't miss how this ship survives its own ambition.